la actividad. Bueno, cuando Michel Foucault observara que uno de los rasgos centrales de la modernidad ha sido la captura de la vida como sustrato biológico por parte de una serie de técnicas disciplinares regularizadoras que en su conjunto constituyen lo que él llamó el biopoder, no podía, supongo yo, avisorar el despliegue acelerado que ha tenido los últimos 25 años del siglo XX y hasta la actualidad, ¿verdad? El campo llamado de las ciencias de la vida, en especial la genética y la neurociencia, así como sus traducciones tecnológicas, ¿no? Estoy pensando en los screen, los marcadores genéticos, la farmacología, las neuroimágenes, los marcadores neuronales, todo lo que ha abierto una senda insospechada para el desarrollo de las regulaciones de nuevo tipo que se despliegan con mayor intensidad, como nunca antes, sobre la vida biológica. No solo se han acentuado las disciplinas a las que están sometidos los cuerpos de los individuos, o las regulaciones cada vez más precisas de las que son objeto las poblaciones, sino que ahora se ha abierto todo un nuevo campo de intervención molecular, que como el propio Nicholas Ross lo ha señalado, se moviliza tras una racionalidad preventiva que busca revisar e intervenir aún antes que las conductas se exterioricen, o si se prefiere, aún antes que una conducta se evidencie como patologizada o criminalizada. Es el campo creciente, lo sabemos, ¿no?, de la medicina preventiva y del control precriminal. Un control anterior, en tal sentido performativo, de aquello que se busca controlar. Por primera vez en la historia de la humanidad asistimos quizás a la posibilidad de intervenir la vida biológica en su sustrato más originario, ¿no? Esto es, en sus configuraciones moleculares, ya sean estas en sus sinergias genéticas o en sus circuitos neuronales. ¿Significa esto que asistimos casi inadvertidamente a una transformación radical de la vida humana? Y si es así, ¿qué habría de esperar de las transformaciones que ello conllevaría en el plano social y político? Son estas algunas de las preocupaciones que es posible encontrar en el trabajo, en tal sentido fascinante, que ha ocupado a nuestro invitado, el profesor Nicholas Ross, a lo largo de su extensa carrera académica. Nicholas Ross es un destacado sociólogo y teórico social británico, actualmente profesor y director del departamento del Social Science, Health and Medicine del King College de Londres y codirector del Centro para la Biología Sintética y la Innovación, un gran proyecto de investigación formado con la colaboración del King College y del Imperial College de Londres, y que hoy día precisamente está teniendo una conferencia importante sobre armas biológicas en Londres. Anteriormente fue James Martin White, profesor de Sociología en la London School of Economics y director por muchos años, desde el 2011 al 2012 al 2011, del influyente Centro BIOS, ¿no?, para el estudio de la biociencia, biomedicina, biotecnología y la sociedad. Pero, sin lugar a duda, lo que más conviene resaltar, me parece a mí, en la carrera de Nicholas Ross es su extensa e innovadora obra en el campo de los estudios de la gubernamentalidad. Ahí Ross ha destacado, sin lugar a duda, como uno de los principales no Foucaultianos, post-Foucaultianos en la academia anglosajona, lo que no es menor, ¿no? Su trabajo explora cómo los desafíos científicos han cambiado las concepciones de la identidad humana y de la gobernanza, y cómo ello impacta en nuestra vida política, sociocultural, jurídica e incluso urbana, ¿no?, como va a ser, entiendo, el tópico de la conferencia que el profesor Ross impartirá esta noche. Su obra ha sido traducido a 3 idiomas, ¿no?, y en ella, desafortunadamente, poco al español. Acabo de recorrer algunas de las librerías de Santiago y se encuentra poca, lamentablemente, obras del profesor Ross. Y en ella destacan, por eso lo leo en inglés, Governing the Soul, Inventing Ourselves, Power of Freedom, The Politics of Life, ese sí, traducido en argentino, Governing the Present, y su último texto junto con Ali Ratchet, Neuro, The New Brain Science and the Management of the Mind. Para el equipo organizador, el núcleo de investigación en biopolítica e ideología de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Chile, para la Facultad de Ciencias Jurídicas y Sociales de la Universidad de Talca, para el doctorado en Psicología de la Universidad de Portales, es un honor tener por primera vez en Chile a Nicolás Boos y, bueno, invitarlos a escuchar su conferencia de hoy. Con ustedes, Nicolás Boos.
Well, good evening everyone, and thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thanks to you all for coming here. As Ricardo said, my work has spanned many fields, and many will know me as a student of governmentality and a theorist of biopolitics. And in the three talks that I'm going to be giving when I'm here in Santiago, I'm going to talk about some of those issues more directly, but here, perhaps somewhat to your surprise, I'm going to try and do something different, which is to talk about a recent project that my colleagues and I are undertaking on mental life in the metropolis, which has actually led to an empirical piece of work that we're doing in some megacities, initially in Shanghai and in Sao Paulo, but why not also in Santiago. So all my work has really been about one question. What kinds of creatures do we think we are, us contemporary human beings? How have we come to think of ourselves in this way? And what consequences does that have for the way in which we're governed by others and the way in which we govern ourselves? And over my very long career, I've looked at the emergence of psychological conceptions of human beings. I've looked at the way in which our somatic identity is being shaped and reshaped by developments in the life sciences. And most recently, in my book with Joël Abirechet that was published in 2013, I've looked at some of the ways in which neuroscience is changing the ways in which we're understanding ourselves, not so much in terms of our psyche, but in terms of our neurobiology. So, if these modes of understanding ourselves are changing, are mutating, what implications does that have, or should that have, for the social and human sciences? If we can understand the emergences and the transformations of our contemporary politics of life, can we actually intervene to transform that politics of life? Or to use a phrase from the great anthropologist Didier Fassin in some recent work of his, is another politics of life possible? So this paper is about whether another politics of life is possible, and whether or not we're at a transformative moment, in particular in the relationship between the social sciences and the life sciences. Now we know that that relationship historically has been very fraught, and we know the history of many critiques of biological accounts of human conduct, fatalistic, reductionistic, deterministic. You don't need me to tell you about the bloody history of biological politics from the 18th century through the 20th century. But I think we are at a moment when biology is trying to change its ways, trying to break with its asocial reductionism, forced to do so by the science itself, by developments in genomics and in neuroscience. And we're also in a moment where the social sciences are beginning to flirt, at least, with the idea that you need to take seriously the fact that human beings are living, vital organisms. You can see that in feminist materialism. You can see that in the rise of affect theory, which is very popular in UK and Europe. I don't know whether it's come to Chile yet. So can the social sciences go beyond their suspicious relationship with the life sciences, their hermeneutics of suspicion? Can we accept the fact that social relations leave measurable, biological, neurobiological traces from the moment of conception on? Can we accept the fact that biology and neurobiology enables and constrains human action, and that humans are indeed organisms? Strange organisms, but organisms, living creatures nonetheless. In other words, is a new conversation possible between the social sciences and the life sciences? I guess that conversation, the reason why I moved from the London School of Economics, which has no medicine, biology or life sciences, to King's College, which has the greatest concentration of medicine and life sciences in Europe, one of the reasons why I moved there was to see whether it was possible to have that conversation. Of course, we shouldn't abandon our critical faculties, and there's a lot to be critical of in contemporary biology. But criticism isn't the same as critique. And is there a way of absolutely exemplifying what it would mean for the social sciences and the life sciences to work together? Well, that was the challenge that my colleagues and I at King's set ourselves a few years ago, to see whether or not we could find an empirical project where we could explore that link. And the question that we chose to look at was the question of mental life in the metropolis, mental life in the city. And at a moment when, as is said, it's so often it's a cliche, when over half the world's population lives in cities, especially in cities that have expanded hugely over the last decade, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Shanghai, etc., the banlieue of Paris, which are much in our minds today, or in my mind at least. Is there a way of making that an empirical project? Well, there's a research council in the UK called the Economic and Social Research Council. It's not noted for its innovative and experimental funding of research, that has to be said. But a couple of years ago, it had this idea that it was going to fund what it called transformative research in the social sciences. And the great advantage of this particular research call was that you only had to write about 500 words. You had to have a great idea, you had to send it into the ESRC, and then you had to spend a day down at a hotel near the headquarters of the ESRC, pitching your project, as they say, to other researchers, and at the end everybody scored everybody else, and in 2 days you knew whether or not you were going to get your money, and they gave us £250,000 to do this work on mental life and mental health in the metropolis, or rather whether you could transform the relationship between social sciences and neuroscience through a study of mental life in the metropolis. And as it happens, if I get to it at the end, which I don't think I will, this project has also been refunded now by a so-called Newton Fund. So we're starting to do this work in megacities, first of all in Shanghai, whose population has increased by 10 million over the last 5 or 6 years to 26 or 27 million, and also in Sao Paulo. So where does this project start? This project starts with an observation that goes back really to the beginnings of urbanization in the 19th century. That there are characteristic patterns of mental disorder across urban space. Of course, us sociologists know, don't trust the statistics, don't trust the diagnoses. We're brought up to be very, very skeptical of any of this epidemiological evidence. Let us just put that to one side for a minute. Let's assume that there are characteristic patterns of mental disorder across urban space. And if we go back to the early history of the social sciences, we find that those were argued to arise from the characteristics of living in the metropolis itself, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. From about the mid-20th century, those arguments, there was something about urban living that shaped and reshaped the mental life of individuals. Those arguments fell out of fashion, and it was argued that, all right, if there were characteristic patterns of mental disorder in the inner city, that's because people who were susceptible to particular types of mental disorder drifted into the ghettos of the inner city, the so-called theory of urban drift. And across this period, sociologists charted out the problems of urban life. They charted out the problems of marginalization, of exclusion, poverty, overcrowding, racism and the like, but they weren't very concerned, excuse me, they weren't very concerned with the mechanisms, with how this experience of living in the city got under the skin and shaped and reshaped the biology and the neurobiology of individuals. So today, faced as we are with this new period of urbanization, is there a way of doing some work which revisits those early questions? Might it even have some potential impact in how we design our forms of urban life? Well, I don't know very much about your wonderful city of Santiago, but that little graph there is an indication of how the population of Santiago has increased over the last 20 years or so. And on the other side of the screen is just a little indication of the distribution of psychiatric disorders going back now about 15 years. A colleague of mine called Ricardo Araya, who's a Chilean neuroscientist, epidemiologist who works at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and is involved in a little bit of our work. I won't talk about Santiago, but let's talk about how the city was understood in the late 19th century. In the late 19th century, I'm sure those of you who studied sociology know, there was a great interest in exploring what modernity meant for those who moved into the city. In the UK, Henry Mayhew charted out the lives of the London poor and the London labourers, explored the dark continent of the city as if he was an explorer in Africa. And in the late 19th century, as I'm sure many of you will know, one of the classic theories here was that of degeneration or degeneracy, that people moved from the healthy countryside into the unhealthy city where they got into vice, they got into drinking, they got into gambling, they got into the unhealthy miasma of the city, and gradually that destroyed their constitution, one of the many ways in which one began to see the theory of degeneracy emerging. Charles Baudelaire was one of the most acute documenters of what he thought was going on when people moved from the rural bliss of the countryside with the peaceful succession of the seasons into the city where people were constantly meeting other people, they were being buffeted around by all sorts of experiences, they were in the company of strangers. That indeed was what he called modernity. And Walter Benjamin also was one of those who documented those early experiences, thinking here of Berlin, of London and of Paris, but perhaps most significant was a paper published by George Simmel called The Metropolis of Mental Life. And what was interesting about Zimmel's study was that he was completely unconcerned with that division that grew up later on in the 20th century between psychological explanations and sociological explanations. For Simmel, one of the founders of the discipline I find myself in, the experience of living in the city transformed an individual at the level of their nervous system. And those who've read Simmel know he argued that the experience of being with strangers, fleeting impressions, all the noise, all the stimuli, etc., created in the citizen, the successful citizen of the urban, a kind of blasé attitude, because that was the only, you had to sort of separate yourself, insulate your nerves from all that stimulation outside, because that was the only way in which you could survive. Mental life was fundamentally shaped by your experience of living, in this case, in the metropolis, the kinds of metropolises that he was looking at. Now, of course, excuse me, too many hours on airplanes. Simmel was looking at the European cities, but not very much later, the Chicago School began mapping the vital city of Chicago. And in Park and Burgess's classic study of Chicago, they say this: the city is not merely a physical mechanism and an artificial construction. It's involved in the vital processes of the people who compose it. It's a product of nature. The city is vital as much as it's geographical, as much as it's architectural, as much as it's spatial. And the classic study of this in the Chicago School Spirit was a study done by Farris and Dunham, again in Chicago, called Mental Disorders in Urban Areas. Now to us, Farris and Dunham's study looked very archaic. You know, they're charting out schizophrenia in the adult population in Chicago. They're mapping schizophrenia. Some of the ways in which they describe this would horrify many of us liberal thinkers today, but nonetheless, they are vitalists. They are vitalists. And this is what they say, Farris and Dunham. The human mind is built on and never independent of a physiological base. The mind is also a product of social interaction. Mentality, abilities, behavior are all achievements of the person developed in a history of long interaction with his surroundings, physical and social. Paths of physiological communication, including sense organs, nerve paths connecting with centers, all supported by sufficiently normal functioning in many parts of the body, including glands, muscles, and so on. And the only reason I mention these early protagonists of sociology, from Zimmel to the Chicago School, people I think most sociologists would be happy to embrace as their forebears, is that they didn't think there was something fundamentally wrong about that recognition that urban life, that forms of urban life were not just a form of human living, but it was a form of human living that shaped the body and soul of the urban inhabitant. Now, as I said, that vitalism, and I'm happy to call it vitalism, soon went out of fashion. There were many empirical problems with Farris and Dunham's work. They got explored, they got criticized. Even Farris and Dunham said, yeah, it's true, there are many problems with our work. The argument began to develop, as I mentioned before, that it was not the city itself that was the problem. What was the problem was that people were drifting into the city, and those with vulnerable constitutions were badly affected by city life. And social psychiatry became a purely epidemiological discipline, merely charting out the distribution of these disorders across urban space and correlating them. Correlation was the highest explanatory form that was aspired to. And at the very same moment, the idea that there should be some collaborative work between sociology and biology. The social sciences should work with biology. There should be a sociology in psychiatry. That went completely out of fashion. And instead, we got the emergence, which I and many of my generation were part of not sociology in psychiatry, but sociology of psychiatry. Let's see how psychiatry works as an instrument of biopolitics, as a mechanism of social control. Let's not involve ourselves with the psychiatric project itself. An unbridgeable gap seemed to have opened up between the social sciences and the life sciences and psychiatry in particular. Well, that unbridgeable gap is the gap that I want to see whether we can begin to bridge. And I think there are some resources that we might have to help us bridge that gap, to see whether another politics of life is possible. Geographers these days don't much like maps. You know, maps are very 20th century, so last century. But I quite like maps. This, as I say, we got this money from the ESRC, and we set up a series of workshops with historians, with urbanists, with neuroscientists, with psychiatrists, trying just in a gentle way to bring the disciplines together and see if we could stay in a room for 2.5 days without grappling with one another, arguing with one another, throwing mud at one another, whether a new conversation was possible. One of the colleagues who was involved in this was James Kirkbride, who's worked on Nottingham. So these are some maps of the distribution of schizophrenia in Nottingham at different historical moments in the 1970s, in the 1980s, up to the 2000s. And you can see, I'm not going to go into these maps in any detail, but although Nottingham, which is a city in the Midlands of the United Kingdom, has changed a lot, the map of psychiatric disorder, in this case it's schizophrenia, whatever that troubling concept might mean, has stayed relatively simple. These are some other maps just downloaded off the internet from New York. These show the distribution of psychiatric distress in New York by neighborhood. And again, without wanting to go into this map, what we did in our little seminar was try and see whether this map, these maps of the distribution of psychiatric disorder, correlated well with the kinds of things that you might think they might. Do they correlate with housing density? No, they don't. Do they correlate with deprivation? No, they don't. Do they correlate with racial exclusion? No, they don't. Do they correlate with incidents of violence? No, they don't. The picture looks a little bit more complicated than that. So if we take these maps not as the solution, because they might help us organise our psychiatry services or whatever, but as the problem, we're then left with this question. So this is really the question where I think the dialogue needs to start. And this little phrase has become a cliche very rapidly, I know. How does adversity get under the skin? How does the experience of violence, of exclusion, of racism, of density, of unemployment, of all those things that we know are adverse forms of life, how do they get under the skin of so many of our fellow citizens? How do they shape their life chances? How do they shape their patterns of health and illness? And how do they bring so many of them to an early death? Well, as I say, this idea that life gets under your skin has become extremely popular these days. There are many research projects looking at how life gets under your skin. Of course, many of them look at mice and rats, as you'll see there in a classic paper by one of the few people working in psychiatry who's really, I think, tried to grapple with this conceptually. Steve Hyman, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, now director of the Broad Institute. How does adversity get under the skin, and do we have any clues as to how we might look at this? Well, perhaps the first clues that we have are from genetics. And I'm sure many of you who study genetics will know that there's a long history of work on gene-environment interactions. Of course, genes are very important. Geneticists have said for ages and ages and ages that genes don't immediately cause disorders. There are environmental triggers of certain kinds of disorders. So if you have a susceptibility, maybe the environment will trigger off this disorder. Well, in this interesting work by two colleagues of ours at King's College London, Avshalom Caspi and Terry Moffat, they did some work looking at a long cohort study in New Zealand, the Dunedin study, and for the purposes of my talk here, the details of their work are not terribly important. What is important is a slight, and I think nonetheless a fundamental change in the way in which geneticists are starting to think about these matters. A move from saying genetics are the cause and environments the trigger, to say no, environments are the cause, but they only have their effects on certain individuals. We know that environmental adversity is one of the major causes of many disorders, but what we don't know, and what at present we are unable to specify, is why some individuals might succumb and others might not. So a move, genes cause, environments trigger, to environments cause, but why and how does environment have its effects on specific individuals or on specific groups of individuals? Second kind of clue that we have to these sorts of questions comes from the very popular field of epigenetics. Now, many social scientists are getting hugely excited, probably over-excited by epigenetics. What's epigenetics? Epigenetics is the recognition, at last the recognition, that actually what's important in shaping anybody's life is not so much the genes they inherit, but the way in which those genes are shaped and developed over the course of a lifetime. I was a baby biologist sometime last century, and the first thing that was taught to me as I was a baby biologist, actually I was working on fruit flies, which you may not think of the best model animal for the human being, but they're pretty good for baby biologists, I can tell you, because you can do work on them in test tubes. They have a very rapid breeding cycle, and they're convenient enough to have lots and lots of mutations, so you red eyes, white eyes, straight wings, curly wings, and things like that. And also, they're God's gift to biologists, or at least to biologists in the 1960s, because the Drosophila melanogaster, my prof's favourite model animal, has for some reason huge chromosomes in its salivary glands. They're so big that if you're a first-year undergraduate, you can tease them out of your little fruit fly, which is about so big, and you can look at them under a microscope. And in those days when we didn't know much about genes, but we did know that there were bands, and you could see the bands on the chromosome. That's entirely by the by. But what my dear Prof. John Maynard Smith drummed into us, of course, is that every cell in the body has exactly the same inherited DNA. So why do some cells turn into liver, some cells turn into leukocytes, some cells turn into whatever you like? It's not because of the inherited DNA. It's because of what activates or disactivates the DNA over the course of a lifetime. And what activates or disactivates the DNA is what's the milieu of the DNA, whether it's its cells, whether it's other cells, whether it's inputs from the environment itself. The human genome has only about 20,000 coding regions. So what shapes the development of those 20,000 coding regions into all the differences amongst us human beings here? It's the effect of the environment in methylating or demethylating, shaping the activation of those genes. So you're beginning to see, and again that's a little slice from nature. I've left my pointer behind, so never mind, it's on the right side of the screen. Instead of in their nature, now in Nature magazine, in their nurture, again you see the mice there. It's the experiments with mice and rats that show us that if you take mice and rats with absolutely identical genetic complement, how they develop over the course of their lifetime, how they thrive or how they don't thrive, how they treat their own offspring well or badly, that is a result not of the genes that they inherit, but of the experience they have from the moment of conception onwards. Unfortunately, when it comes to rats and mice, the most important part of that experience, so the researchers tell us, is the amount of licking and grooming that the baby mice gets from its mother mice, and that affects the amount of licking and grooming that the baby mice will give to its own infants when it grows up, and so on, down all the generations. So it's not a great story, I blame the mother. Yet again, it's the mothers that are at stake. But nonetheless, the general point is an important one. The general point is beginning to transform the way in which biologists think about the nature of their vital object. I've been doing quite a lot on work on the brain over the last 10 years. And what comes out of that work on the brain is that the brain, too, is the most modulatable organ, is the organ most shaped by its experience in its organism from the moment of conception onwards. Actually, we have known this for really a long time. In the top little box on the screen here is Donald Hebb, and even when I was at university, Donald Hebb was famous for the little epigram, what fires together, wires together. When two nerve cells fire together, they develop a relationship with one. That's what memory is, at least that's what memory was for Donald Hebb. And indeed the idea that there was plasticity in the brain goes right back to the first neuroanatomist to get a Nobel Prize, Raymond E. Cajal, who began to argue that right from the very beginning the brain was plastic. Plastic by which it means shaped in its very physical structure by the environment in which it's immersed with over a life history over a time span which ranges from milliseconds to decades, across the whole experience. Your brains, even if you have been sleeping through my talk, will not be the same when you go out of this room as they were when you came into this room, whether that's because you're checking your emails or you're watching the result of the England-France match, which we just hope has gone off peacefully. I was watching the singing of the Marseillaise before I came out here tonight. Your brain will have changed. Seriously. Perhaps the next big change came about with the work on brain repair. The person in the blue shirt there is Paul Bakirita. Paul Bakirita showed that people, actually showed with a member of his family first of all, that people who had massive areas of their brain destroyed by stroke could regain those functions by intensive exercise that would enable different parts of the brain to take on the activities and the functions of those bits of the brain that had been damaged by stroke. There was a lot of work on cortical remapping, some of it very controversial. Edward Taub, you can see there, again I've lost my pointer. What you may ask, well, why is the monkey there? Well, because Edward Taub's work, very controversially, was done on the so-called silver spring monkeys. These were monkeys that were the subject of one of the first big campaigns against the use of experimental animals. Their brains were ablated in various ways, or their limbs were restricted in various ways. And the research showed that different parts of the brain could take on the functions of other parts of the brain. In fact, going back to the governmentality work, which I'm not going to talk about today, both Edward Taub and Mike Merzenich very rapidly turned these things into commercial products for retraining the brain. And you can see a little cut there from Mike Merzenich's Posit Science and Brain HQ. These are brain training technologies. I'm not going to talk about them today, although I will probably talk about them in one of my other talks. And the last little bit of this puzzle, before we get back to the main theme, is that of neurogenesis. Now, it was argued for ages and ages that apart from the first few years when your brain was developing, your brain could develop no new neurons. From your early life to your death, everything that you did could only result in the death of neurons and not the birth of new ones. Every cigarette that you smoke, and if you used to smoke in the old days when people smoked, every glass of wine, glass of whiskey, or a glass of that you take can only lead to one thing, the death of brain cells. And there was actually quite a good argument for this dogma that no new brain cells could be produced over the course of a lifetime, because the adult mammalian brain is extremely complicated. And can you imagine new nerve cells coming in? What would they do to mess up the wiring? But actually, in some incredibly elegant work by Elizabeth Gould and her colleagues, she demonstrated that actually new brain cells could be formed, and indeed were formed, over the course of a lifetime. And whether or not they were formed, in the same way as whether or not cells died, depended very greatly on the kinds of experience that the individual had over the course of their lifetime. Now, of course, as you'll see from the text on the screen there, again, this is not necessarily good news. There's a lot of stuff there about the way in which early experience of a baby with its mother is the most transformative thing that happens to the baby's brain. But nonetheless, here we are beginning to get the idea that the brain is something in the world. The brain itself is the most open, modulatable, mutable brain. It might be managed, it might be understood, but it's open to its medium. It's transformed by experience, and it affects and is affected by everything that passes through it. Now, of course, as I've indicated in this very, very quick Cook's tour, as we would call it in the UK, of some of these developments, there are many, many, many problems. And in the book that I wrote with Joël Abirachet, we argued that our relationship, the relationship of the social sciences to the life sciences and the neurosciences, should be one of friendship, but it should be one that we call critical friendship. Critical friendship. But nonetheless, I think it would be wrong to turn our back on this recognition that the body and the brain is shaped from the moment of conception onwards by its immersion in its milieu, by the organism's relationship to its milieu. And this goes back, of course, to some holistic biologist. Kurt Goldstein is one with his fabulous book, The Organism. It goes back to some great historical epistemologists who've been very influential on my work, George Congian, arguing that exactly the same. It's the organism in its milieu. There is no barrier. The skin, the boundaries of the body do not mark an unpenetrable barrier between a living thing and its environment, as we used to think. There's interpenetration. What's the relevance of this to the urban? Well, actually, what we find excuse me. What we find over the last 5 years in particular is that some of those who are working on these problems that I've mentioned to you, working on the brain, working on epigenesis, working on the neuroplasticity, are beginning to turn their work to the consequences of urban living, what you might call neuro-urbanicity. I want to talk just first very briefly about the epigenetic work. This is the work of Sandro Galea and his colleagues in Detroit. And he says here, coincidence with the growing number of studies that have demonstrated links between features of the urban environment and mental health, there's been an increase in work that sought to understand the mechanisms understanding these epidemiological observations. In particular, there's an emerging interest in identifying biological explanations that may clarify the links between features of the urban environment and individual mental health. Biological explanations, crikey, that's something to really upset the social scientists in the room. We know where biological explanations go and so on. But actually, the work of Galea and his group is really rather interesting, because what they argue, using the arguments from epigenetics that I mentioned before, and using some work that they've done studying the population of Detroit, is to argue that DNA methylation, that is the activation and inactivation of genes, can explain the link between individual exposure to adversity and the development of mental illness. What they did was they did a study of residents in a neighborhood in Detroit. They found that there were distinct patterns, these epigenetic patterns, in individuals who suffered acts of violence. Indeed, they found a linear relationship between the number of acts of violence, the number of assaults that an individual had encountered, and their epigenetic profile, and the development that they found in that population of different kinds of psychiatric disorder. Cumulative traumatic burden, they said, may leave a molecular footprint in those who have suffered PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And what they go on to say is that the advantage of actually understanding this mechanism is that the mechanism may itself be reversible, or you may begin to see by understanding the mechanism what kinds of interventions you might want to make on urban space in order to transform the health or the mental health consequences of the individuals who live here. This was another really popular argument, certainly in the UK, by the gentleman who you see there on the screen, Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg, who argued that being brought out of the city or living in the city affected the way in which individuals processed stress. Stress was something that people experienced in the city. How you process stress in the brain would have a fundamental effect on on your mental health and the forms of mental life that you experience. He did a lot of the famous type of experiment now, putting people into a scanner, exposing them to different kinds of stressful environments, yakking in their ears here, and he found a difference in the way in which those people who've been brought up in an urban environment or born in an urban environment experience stress. Indeed, he argued that social stress processing was the environmental risk that linked city life to mental ill health, and argued for a series of new studies that tried to explore the ways in which different forms of life, different ways of being brought up in different kinds of urban environments might so shape the plasticity of the brain in order to transform the mental life and the mental health of the inhabitants. I'm not going to really tell you any more about Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg's work because I don't have time to do so. But the important point that he is making here is that in psychiatry, in psychiatric neuroscience in particular, there has been a pretty much complete neglect, at least at the level of mechanism, on the way in which living in a kind of environment shapes body and soul from the moment of conception onwards. And here is a neuroscientist arguing that a new body of studies needs to be done, a new conversation needs to be opened between the life sciences and the social sciences. Well, what should we think about all that? More biological reductionism, another biological explanation of things that ought to have social explanations, another fatalism, not quite a fatalism, another attempt by biologists to try and colonize the territory that's properly the territory of the social scientists with their fancy scanners and their biological research and all their humongous research funding which never comes to us. Or is there a way of going beyond that conversation? Now, in fact, in our workshops that I mentioned to you before, one of our colleagues, Ed Ramsden, a historian, showed that actually we have been here before. In the 1950s and in the 1960s, a group of social scientists, of biologists, of psychiatrists got together, the so-called Committee on Physical and Social Environmental Variables as Determinants of Mental Health, or the so-called Space Cadets, as they called themselves, the Space Cadets. And if you read that name, you'll see some very, very prestigious names from the history of sociology on the list of these Space Cadets. They try to understand exactly the thing that I'm saying that we should try to understand now. They try to understand it, and it has to be said that after 20 years of trying to study it, they failed to identify the variables, the factors, the mechanisms that were involved. Stress was always the way in which they thought about how the urban got under the skin. The gentleman in the white coat there on the screen is Hans Selye. Some of you all know Hans Selye's work was funded by not very reputable sources, but Hans Selye was the architect of stress theory, and he said something relatively profound, I guess. Sounds profound in English, I don't know if it sounds profound in Spanish. Everybody knows what stress is, and nobody knows what stress is. We all know that living in a city is stressful. But honestly, if you live in a village, that's pretty stressful. We all know that unemployment is stressful, but actually work is incredibly stressful. Being on your own is stressful, but being married is pretty stressful too. In other words, everything in one way or other is stressful. Nonetheless, stress has become the all-purpose explanation of how the environment gets under the skin. These are clips from Nature and various other research projects just indicating my point. People trying to map out the city and see what the key thing is about the urban environment that's stressful. Stress is a kind of all-purpose mediator between the urban and the mental. It's a really old-fashioned notion, but it serves to bridge the objective and the subjective, crowds, noise, strangers, family breakdown, discrimination, racism, violence, and so forth. All of those generate psychological responses, and those psychological responses generate hormonal responses, and those hormonal changes, so it is argued, of what shapes your internal biological and neurobiological environment. Your environment, sorry, I'm losing my words here, your neurobiological and biological processes. Stress. So there's a lot of interesting work these days on what is being called, everything has to be omics these days, on what is being called the exposome. It is the exposome that is responsible in the urban environment for reshaping and shaping again your biology and your neurons. Well, in our little discussions at our urban brain lab, we were pretty unhappy with this notion of stress. One of my colleagues, Craig Morgan, a bit like the Sandra Galea kind of argument, says on the basis of his work in South East London that actually it's not just stress, it's a very specific kind of experience that generates psychiatric problems. It's the experience of being in a situation of being bullied, of being maltreated, of being subject to severe threats and hostilities without any possibility of escaping them. And this links to what George Ongian and Kurt Goldstein would call a catastrophic situation, because they argue that it is in the nature of a living organism to be able to mold its environment to itself. Even if that living organism is a mouse, or a rat, or a cat, or a dog, it is shaping and reshaping its media throughout its whole life. And the situation of an organism unable to do that is what they call a catastrophic situation. In fact, they say this in particular in relation to a whole body of biological research which uses laboratory animals as a way of trying to identify the nature of the kinds of mechanisms that are involved. Laboratory animals, by definition, are unable to create and recreate their media. They are just stuck in their cages. So they are in catastrophic situations. But in all this work that's being done here about stress, strangely what's missing is mental life itself. And I guess it's mental life itself that takes us really back to those old sociological studies. Mental life in the metropolis. How the metropolis affects mental life. Can mental life affect biological life? Or is mental life such an old-fashioned notion that we give it no place these days? Well, the guy who I think has the best claim to be the inventor of social neuroscience, John Hacia, has done some very interesting work on loneliness. Loneliness, of course, lonely in a crowd, is one of the big characteristics of people who live in major cities these days. And loneliness can bring you to illness and an early death. But what's interesting about Hachapo's work is what he means by loneliness. So you might think, being a social neuroscientist, what he would mean by loneliness is something like the number of social contacts that an individual has in a day, in a week, or in a month. And maybe you could classify those, you could calibrate those, you could have a scale, etc., etc. No, that is not what he says. He says what's important is not the number of social contacts that you have, but your subjective sense of social isolation. It's your subjective sense of social isolation that disrupts your perceptions, disrupts your behavior, disrupts your physiology, becoming a trap that not only reinforces isolation, that can lead to early death. It's that subjective experience subjective perception of social isolation
la que nos
that
lleva a un
shapes and
aislamiento
reshapes
social,
the individual's
la
biology.
que le da
Now,
forma a la
once it
biología
seems to me that
individual.
someone like Pachaco
Y para mí,
opens his hand,
el
opens
trabajo lo
his
que hizo
mind
es
to
abrir
that
su
idea
mente
that it is not the
hacia
brute
esa idea,
fact of an experience, but the
hacia lo que
way in
es
which that experience is
la
coded, is
experiencia, hacia dónde
understood,
está,
is
hacia
related
dónde
to
se
how you think
entiende
others
y
experience
hacia
it.
dónde
It's related to norms,
experimentan los
it's
otros
related
con
to
respecto a
values,
las
it's related to
normas,
history, it's
valores,
related to
historia,
language. Then all the
lenguaje,
things that the sociologists and social
cosas
scientists
que
and
los
human scientists
sociólogos
have been studying for so long
han
come
estado
rushing back into
estudiando
the picture.
y científicos han estado estudiando por mucho tiempo.
Of course, in all this discussion about mental life and the metropolis, I've kind of ignored the question of what a metropolis is. What is a city? And this again, I think, is where a conversation can begin. I mentioned at the beginning Mayhew's London, London Labour, and London Poor. Well, here on the screen, these are some of Mayhew's caricatures of costermongers and of street urchins and so on, which anyone familiar with his work will know. These are the pictures of London in the 19th century when Mayhew was thinking of London. That's the urban of London. This is the urban that Baudelaire and Walter Benjamin were talking about. Berlin, Paris, around the turn of the century. This is the city that Sandra Galea and his colleagues were talking about. Detroit, in the 2000s, crack city, a decaying industrial city. These are the cities with which we're beginning to be concerned with. Mumbai, Shanghai, Rio, Pudong. And in fact, the work that we're doing is comparing how people live, how the migrants to these cities live in these two cities. Well, actually, we're not looking at Rio for historical reasons, we're looking at Sao Paulo, but those of you who know how the migrants to the cities in your fellow country, Brazil, live, will know that by and large they are housed in favelas, in the middle, quasi-legal favelas, in the middle of the city. Why they live in the favelas is because often they work in the service industries, so they have to be at work at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, and attempts to rehouse them so they've got a 3-hour bus ride before they get to work in the morning are understandably not terribly popular. So that's one way of urban living. In the bottom screen there you can see Pudong. I don't know how many of you have been to Shanghai recently. If you fly to the international airport in Shanghai, you will fly to the airport at Pudong, which was built on the marshes on the uninhabited side of the Wangpu River. Now there's a 45-minute drive from the airport to the centre of the city. All along that 45-minute drive, you will see this forest of skyscrapers. It's in that forest of skyscrapers that the 10 million people who come to Shanghai from the countryside, the 10 million children who left their old elderly parents behind in the rural areas and come to Shanghai. That's how they live. How do these different ways of living shape the form of life, shape the life experiences, shape the mental life of those who come? That's the question that we're asking ourselves. What are you to look at? Are you to look at the exposome? Are you to look at the microbiome? We're now beginning to realize that the human being is inhabited by hundreds of millions of microbes of different sorts, and this work on the microbiome, which is absolutely crucial to human health, is extremely interesting and shows yet another way in which the boundaries of the skin do not mark as of right the boundaries of a living organism. How about pollution? How about pathogens and the circulation of pathogens across the city? Is there a way that those who understand urban experience, working with the biologists and life sciences, to try and understand the forms of life that are taking shape in these new cities, and maybe to find some ways of intervening in them? Well, that's our project. And I can already hear the question. Yes, we could study this, couldn't we? It's a great example of biopolitics. The way in which these new forms of knowledge are shaping the way in which we're beginning to think about human beings in the city and reshaping the kinds of government that we use for them, reshaping the forms of expertise that is given power over them, and so on. That would be one kind of research, and it's not a kind of research that I decry. We're quite good at doing that biopolitics work. It's difficult, but we kind of know how to do it. But as I said right at the beginning, my question was, is another form of life, another politics of life, another kind of execution? Well, so what? Why should we want to know the mechanisms? Surely all this biological stuff is just a hypothesized mechanism to understand phenomena that we know very well. We know poverty is bad for people. We know racism is bad for people. We know exclusion is bad for people. We know bad housing is bad for people. Why bring in your biologists with their exposomes, their genomics, their brain scanners and all that kind of thing to kind of prey on the poor people in the city? Just give people more money. Probably right. But still, our argument is that understanding that mechanism, reopening that discussion, is not only conceptually important, it's not only important to reopen the dialogue with the life sciences, but might actually transform some of the status of the social sciences themselves, transform them from an endless commentary on the world and give them a greater traction for intervening. And this, I think, is what Didier Fassin, who I mentioned at the beginning, means life as such. Understanding life as a course of events which occurs from birth to death, which can be shortened by political or structural violence, which can be prolonged by health and social policies, which gives place to cultural interpretations and moral decisions, which may be told or written, life which is lived through a body, not only through cells, and as a society, not only as a species. So I suppose I'd like to associate myself with that other politics of life and ask whether or not that is something that one might begin to do, to understand how the social life of the city and the molecular life of the body have become entangled and what the consequences might be. And as I said, and this is where I'll end, that work is now being funded, I'm delighted to say, under this Newton scheme. We're beginning to work on it, my colleagues and I, on trying to reopen that dialogue. And indeed, I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but I think it's a thing which both sides want to do. That, life stresses, that's an editorial from Nature, time for sociologists and biologists to bury the hatchet and cooperate to study the effects of environmental stress on how human beings behave. Sociologists stand to benefit from the understanding that biology will bring to their own vindicated empirical research. Biologists have to realize that a century of social scientific research has actually mapped out across urban space what the consequences are, but what it hasn't done is looked at the mechanism. And trying to collaborate to understand those mechanisms, well, that's something which I've argued for myself in this paper I wrote in Theory, Culture and Society a while ago. I sent it out to about 15 reviewers. 14 of them hated it, but nonetheless they still published it, arguing for a new collaborative relationship between the social sciences and the life sciences. Difficult work, perhaps it'll go nowhere, perhaps we'll just replicate what the space cassettes did, I don't know. But it seems to me a way in which one might engage with one of the major challenges of today, which is the huge mobility of migrants across the globe and of migrants from the rural areas to the cities. And it doesn't seem to me to be an unimportant question to investigate. So thanks to my colleagues, thanks to Des Fitzgerald, to Eleanor Singh, to my colleagues in the Urban Brain Lab, and thanks to you for your attention.
Gracias a ustedes.